welcome to the new episode of Beyond the Indus with your host, Tushar Shetty.
And I'm Joe Wellham.
And Joe, it's been an interesting week for several reasons. We've had the long-anticipated Modi visit to the US, and I do want to get your reaction on that. We've also had some interesting developments in Russia with the whole Prigozhin coup. So a very exciting time for the world in general. But speaking of unexpected invasions, Joe, you've had a couple of interesting visitors this week, haven't you?
You could say as much, that's for sure. I came in the office, which was a bit unexpected. I mean, it is the time of year with the monsoon coming in. I'm told the first week or two is when we typically tend to see more snakes than usual. But yeah, it keeps you on your toes. I mean, I won't make any jokes about previous offices that I've worked in. But yeah, if you hear a sudden silence from my side, then you know what's happened to me in this week's episode.
Well, in the past, you've always had interesting remedies to a lot of ailments, like sunburn, for instance. Do you have a folk remedy for cobra bites?
So actually, my office landlord sent round a priest to bless the office. So we're now confident that going forward, it's going to be a snake-free zone.
Fantastic. Okay, so Joe, it's been an interesting week, and I do want to get your reactions on, or rather your reactions to the reactions to Modi's state visit. We've seen a lot of different reports coming from the US. Obviously, aside from the main Modi-Biden meetings and the numerous deals that have been struck, there's also been a lot of commentary in the media, particularly in a lot of progressive outlets, the Washington Post, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. And Joe, there does seem to be this really strong narrative that despite growing US-India ties, there seems to be a perception, at least in certain parts of the US political spectrum, that India and the United States, despite being democracies, don't really share the same values. And this is more an alliance of convenience. And that's something that I wasn't too happy about because I did read a couple of articles, one by Noah Smith, who's an economics blogger, but also by an author called Akhilesh Pillalamari at The Diplomat. And both of them point out that this narrative that India and US don't share values based on the current ruling party of India is a bit short-sighted. And they also point out that Americans have only recently en masse began to pay attention to India. So their perceptions of Indo-US ties or Indo-US shared values may not necessarily be based on a longer historical spectrum. But honestly, I was just heartbroken that my early 20s savior, Bernie Sanders, condemned PM Modi's visit. What response did you have to the commentary ongoing?
Yeah, I saw that Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and a couple of other sort of, I could say, liberal politicians in the United States boycotted Modi's speech at Congress. There's going to be more question marks for Joe Biden as he cozies up to India, with Modi potentially or looking like he's going to be re-elected next year. What I can say is that we look like there's some controversy on the horizon over India's Union Civil Code. That now looks set to, or quite likely to be passed, which would remove laws in India that are set for things like marriage, divorce, tax, along religious lines and make a unified code in the country. And there's a lot of split debate on this. Many people think that it will help pull India together, but then there's also a lot of opposition that say that it wouldn't allow Muslims to follow marriage customs, for example. So I think this is certainly one to watch for, and I think Mr. Biden and the Democrat Party will be questioned over their ties to Modi as and when this new policy is passed.
Fair enough, Joe. And I see you've been very polite and not made any references to any authoritarianism or human rights violations by this government, which is very polite of you. But I do think that there is absolutely a place for criticism, especially when it comes to the sort of values and the platform that's being purported in which India and US are going to be acting in the future. This doesn't seem to be sold, at least to both the US and Indian public, as just a marriage of convenience. But I think that there is a way of criticizing it. And I think I saw an article that talked about over 70 US legislators in the House of Representatives, including some well-known Indian American legislators like Pramila Jayapal. They sent a letter to President Biden, which was effusive in their encouragement and praise for growing India-US ties. They said they completely support it and they're glad that more and more investments and more defense cooperation is going to be happening between India and US. But they did ask President Biden to raise certain questions about authoritarianism, about growing intolerance against Muslims, and about attacks on freedom of press and journalists. All in all, I thought that was a very measured response. Then certain responses we've heard from legislators like Ilhan Omar, for instance.
We've seen the row this week also between Barack Obama and several very senior Indian politicians So Mr. Obama made comments or suggested that India might pull apart if the Modi government didn't improve its treatment of the country's minorities. And this led to quite significant condemnation from Nirmala Sitharaman, India's finance minister, essentially saying that it was quite hypocritical from Mr. Obama. She mentioned that he bombed 6 Muslim countries during his tenure. There were comments that were echoed by Rajnath Singh, who's India's defense minister, who made remarks along similar lines. So I think that the point was made from Delhi that if there's going to be scrutiny on the Indian side, there should be scrutiny on the American side as well.
Yeah, and I remember a visit from Obama when he was president. I believe it was back in 2015. And he made similar statements about human rights and about protection of minorities in Delhi while Modi was prime minister. But the next leg of his international trip was Saudi Arabia. So I do remember a lot of Indians complaining about that same kind of hypocrisy even back then. But yeah, Joe, on to our stories for today. So what have you been following?
So I think there's quite a remarkable shift going on at the moment. The news has kind of been a little bit brushed under the carpet, but quite a significant energy sector overhaul that we're going on, or that we're seeing in India at the moment. And my interest first peaked in the story when the Indian government announced they would not commission any new coal power plants for the next 5 years. That's a pretty major announcement, India being one of the world's largest emitters. Now, it doesn't mean that the use of coal power isn't still going to increase in India due to already commissioned projects. Well, we think the amounts of coal power that are in use will rise in absolute terms by 2030 by about 19%. But what we're seeing now is perhaps the first signs of setting up a real infrastructure for renewables. There are more plans afoot. India says to be mulling its solar panel import taxes and taxes on solar cells to stimulate domestic industry and consumption. I mean, at the moment, there is demand for solar power, but simply not enough supply. And that's partly been down to trying to limit imports from China. A big story this week, or big exclusive in the Financial Times, he reported there'll be a multi-billion-dollar subsidy scheme for companies making electricity grid batteries in India. And further discussions underway to allow foreign companies to invest in India's nuclear power industry for the first time. Perhaps that last one, a bit more controversial than those that came before. I mean, India plans to install around 500 gigawatts of clean energy by 2030, which could power anywhere up to about 500 million homes. But so far, it's only been adding around 20 gigawatts annually. So what we're seeing, I think, is a recognition that not enough has been done before, or not enough has been done up to this point. And this needs to be hiked now. Its proportional consumption of coal use should drop to about 55% by 2030, while hydro, solar, wind and biomass should rise to about 30% by 2030. So I think these new regulations and the new policies, as I said, appear to be offering the kind of renewable sector an opportunity for growth to establish a renewable sector in India. And I think it's one to really an exciting story, I think a positive story to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this move makes sense to invest in more renewables, because if 2022 and 23 have proven anything, it's that the security of energy supplies is an issue that just can't be taken for granted anymore. We're seeing the inflation and the recession that Europe is undergoing right now because they placed all their eggs in the Russian gas supply basket. So I think this is an excellent move. India also spends a considerable amount of foreign exchange on energy imports. And on a wider geostrategic level, we're seeing a lot of moves by China in the Middle East and Central Asia, which are massive suppliers of oil and gas. And therefore, it makes more sense for India to be investing not just for the environment, but also for its own energy security. And on the nuclear note, it's interesting because the India-US detente, when India-US relations started improving, the significant event that marked that was actually the US-India nuclear deal. Basically, the US gave India a waiver in the nuclear supplies group, which was a significant boost to the prospects of the Indian nuclear industry. So yeah, excellent news, both on the energy front as well as for India's transition to an increasingly green economy.
And what have you been keeping an eye on this week, Tish?
So Joe, as we're recording this, the breaking news is that the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down affirmative action in college admissions in the United States. Basically, U.S. colleges are no longer allowed to discriminate based on race when seeking admissions, and this is an issue that affects the Asian American and Indian American community particularly. But there's another debate that's going on in the U.S., which is also related to discrimination, and this one specifically involves the Indian American community. So, as you know, there's a large and growing community of Indians in America. And in the past couple of years, there's been increased attention being given to the issue of caste discrimination within the Indian diaspora. So in 2020, the state of California sued Cisco, one of the world's largest digital communications companies, for caste discrimination. A number of universities have also in the past few years added caste to their non-discrimination policies, universities like University of California, Cal State, and Harvard. But in February of 2023, the city of Seattle became the first city in the United States to pass a law to ban caste discrimination, which was followed in March 2023 by the state of California, which is the largest state in the United States by population and is also home to the largest chunk of the Indian diaspora, more than 20%. These laws would accord caste discrimination a higher level of judicial scrutiny, similar to other protected classes like race or sex. So I got interested in this because the commentary on this issue has been extremely divided. You have the progressive side hailing it as a victory for justice and equality, while organizations like the Hindu American Forum have predictably termed it Hindu-phobic and calling it out specifically for targeting Hindu Americans. But the reason I got interested in this is when I looked into it, every single report I read about this, from the lawsuits to university regulation changes to even legislative debates in US states, they all mentioned one specific organization, Equality Labs. So this organization describes itself as a Dalit civil rights organization dedicated to ending caste apartheid, gender-based violence, Islamophobia, white supremacy, and religious intolerance. And specifically, they all point to a single report published in 2018 called Caste in the United States, a survey of caste among South Asian Americans. So Joe, I went and had a look at this report in detail, and the findings were a little surprising. So to quickly break down caste for foreign listeners, there are basically two components to it. One's sort of this divinely ordained hierarchy called Varna, which is roughly analogous to class in the West. At the top of the hierarchy, you have Brahmins, who are the priests and the scholars and teachers, basically people who deal with the creation and transmission of knowledge. Then come the Kshatriyas, who are the nobles and warriors, then the Vaishyas, the merchants and landowners, and lastly, Shudras, skilled and unskilled labor. Below these, you have Dalits, who are the outcasts, so to speak, for whom the most spiritually undesirable and menial tasks were reserved, and who've honestly been treated with brutal oppression for most of Indian history. This is a caste system that most people in the West are familiar with. But the other aspect of caste, and arguably one that matters more in India, is jati, which roughly translates to clans or communities based on familial and occupational groups. So Joe, for instance, to put in the UK context, a textile mill worker in Manchester, a dock worker in Glasgow, and a street cleaner in London might all identify themselves as working class. But their communities are very different and their occupations are different, and also their experiences with other communities, their living conditions, and their political power will vary considerably based on where they live and what their backgrounds are. So on to the report itself. So firstly, they got their data from a sample size of approximately 1,200 people answering an online questionnaire, which is not bad. But here you already see problems start cropping up, because their survey was open to people identifying as South Asian from Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, as well as the Maldives, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Fiji, Tanzania, and Kenya, which is fair enough, not exactly South Asian, but you do find South Asian diaspora in all those countries. But it's also open to all religious affiliations, which was even a little more curious, because while you do see caste in various forms across different religions in India, the way discrimination manifests in that sense, or where the experiences are, is quite different. So I think it does dilute the quality of this data a little bit. Secondly, for a survey that aims to showcase caste discrimination, particularly in schools and workplaces, they've not actually released any data on schools or workplaces. So, for instance, while we know that 41% of Dalits face discrimination in education, something I don't necessarily doubt, we have no idea whether this was in kindergarten, high school, or in universities. And while 61% of Dalits have faced some form of caste discrimination in the workplace, we also don't know which industries or sectors this might be in. And they've actually collected data. It's actually in their questionnaire, but they've just chosen not to release it. So Joe, the problem is this data is actually really important when you design targeted policies to combat systemic issues. As you know, India is a pretty big country, and caste operates very differently in different parts of the country. So, for instance, people who operate in, let's say, the transport sector or, in the IT sector may actually be from different parts of the country. And consequently, their treatment of other castes might be very different. We don't know this. They've not released any data on which countries the participants are from. They've not released statewide data. They've not even released occupation or education data in terms of specific regions. They have released their respondents' gender identification and their sexual preferences. I'm not sure what this contributes to, but, fair game. The second and the most problematic part about this report, Joe, was the anecdotal case studies they provided to support their data. And while some of these experiences was very harrowing, some of them did not belong in there, and also pointed to some major flaws in their assumptions. And Joe, this is where I had a life-altering revelation. Hear this case. In the temple, especially, we see caste a lot. We are Shetty and thus fall as a Shudra caste. Remember, these are the low-skilled labor, right? These are people who are discriminated against. He points to Iyengar Brahmins from Tamil Nadu and children of Iyengars who made him feel less cool, not Hindu enough. And it even affects his marriage prospects. His parents had to change his last name growing up. Joe, as you know, I'm a Shetty as well. And this revelation that we are Shudra was quite a big revelation for me. I had to have a conversation with my parents. Now, the problem is that while Shetties might be identified as Shudras in some government classification, in reality, they're land-owning caste. And this anecdote points to some major problems this report has with conflation and categorization error. It also points to maybe a lack of understanding of how caste dynamics operate in different societies and the reality of caste on the ground. So, to summarize, there are also some other case studies. For instance, this one. Most Indians in my school were upper caste Hindus, and so I never felt connected to them through Indian culture. They would make fun of the fact that I ate meat and was Christian. In that way, my religion and family history alienated me. I did not know it at the time, but they were Brahmin, and my parents hid from me that I was a Dalit. But if I had known, I could have called out their caste bullying for what it was. So, Joe, this person got bullied perhaps with their religion, which is never good, and it should be addressed. But she was raised Christian. Neither her nor her friends knew that she was from a Dalit background. Her parents didn't even tell her she was a Dalit. And after finding out that she was from a Dalit Christian background much later, she decided that this was caste bullying. So you see, the problem with these case studies is that it obscures the genuine information that I think should come out, which does point to some caste bullying in workplaces. For instance, some reports and case studies point to casteist slurs being used in the workplace, which actually does resemble case studies we've had in India of similar kinds of discrimination, even in elite workplaces. So I'm not saying this report is all fake. I think it does have some strong points, but I do think that by including all these different experiences, not categorizing the data more carefully, and also not providing real data as to the sectors and education places where these incidents occur, it handicaps a lot of people from being able to affect actual change. And while I have no problem with these sort of reports being published, any information in this area is good. The fact that this report almost on its own was used to pass legislation targeting an entire community is concerning. So I would encourage people to go to Equality Labs, have a look at this report for themselves and come to their own decisions. And if you guys have any comments or have more context on this, you can email it as beyondtheindus@gmail.com to give us your point of view. But yeah, what do you think, Joe?
I think you'd make a brilliant journalist. I've said this to you before, but your fact checking is second to none. You're an asset to any newsroom. Yeah, I mean it's been a hot topic, or the caste system in India this week because of a pretty horrific incident. So an upper caste man was caught on video urinating on a lower caste scheduled tribe.
So ST, scheduled tribe, are basically accorded the same status as like Dalits, scheduled caste. I think there's a really good parallel to be drawn for Canadian and American listeners to First Nations or Native American tribes, people who have been discriminated against from the mainstream of society and have to live in their own areas.
Yeah, and it's sort of brought the conversation around caste to the forefront because the individual, Prava Shukla, has been charged under the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Act, given the intention this was a caste-based incident or caste-based crime. There's been a lot of debate on social media this week about the incident and how horrific and how the judicial system and kind of protects people of a higher caste. Allegedly, the victim in this case dropped charges because he was pressurized to do so. And I mean, we've certainly looked into caste a lot when I was working with the Telegraph. So, I mean, we did a piece from Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh looking at manual scavengers. Manual scavenging is the practice where individuals will go down drains or into the sewage system to clean them, particularly during the monsoon months. And it's phenomenally dangerous, one of the world's most dangerous jobs. All sorts of horrors down there, as you can imagine, from poisonous gases to snakes and spiders. And those that do this practice are Dalits, born into doing this job, and it's generational. I think it really struck me then when I was kind of in Jharkhand, in Ranchi, how kind of immersed or prevalent or entrenched the caste system remains for many people in the country. Something that is changing, I believe, but very slowly.
Yeah, and there are a couple of interesting anecdotes that I want to add. So one of them came from a report that was published during the partition of India about sanitation workers in Lahore, Pakistan. And it turned out that a lot of these jobs had been reserved for and only given to Dalit Christians in ostensibly a Muslim majority state where caste shouldn't have been recognized. So the sanitation jobs, which are similar to the manual drain cleaning jobs that you talked about, were reserved for this particular caste in these two religions that don't have caste. And the second thing is an anecdote I heard about South India and Kerala before independence. Now, as we know, Kerala is one of the most educated and highly literate part of India at this point. But back in the day, apparently Dalit castes were not allowed to traverse the same road as Brahmins took. And if they had to use that road for their business, they had to wear a bell around their necks like a cow. So that the Brahmins could hear that noise and then hide in a bush so that they wouldn't be polluted by looking at a Dalit. So when I say this system runs deep and is very, very problematic, it is in the most brutal and horrific way. But like you said, things are changing. I believe that this person who is connected to the BJP party in Madhya Pradesh has had charges brought against him. And there's word of even more severe charges because of special provisions in the law for discrimination against Dalits and tribals. So even stronger charges being brought against him. So hopefully this practice is changing. And I think in India, at least, there is a lot of governmental and official support, even if this hasn't percolated to all sections of society. So, on to our main topic today. We here at Beyond the Indus normally cover more political topics, but one of the most fascinating subjects to explore is the rise of India's economy. And our main topic today has to do with one of the most exciting technologies that have come out of India in recent decades. One of the challenges of managing the Indian economy has always been the sheer scale of it. Providing infrastructure, welfare, regulation, and financial inclusion for over 1.4 billion people is hard, especially in India's diverse and chaotic democracy. But this new technology could be set to change all that and raise the standard of digital governance, not just in India, but worldwide. We're talking, of course, about the India Stack. So even if you're not familiar with the term India Stack, you've definitely heard of or used one of the many technologies that support it, like the Aadhaar Biometric ID program, described as the most sophisticated ID program in the world by former World Bank chief economist Paul Romer. Or perhaps the United Payments Interface, UPI, which processes more than 6 billion transactions per month, making it the world's fifth largest payment interface since its launch in 2016. The India Stack's multi-layered digital platform has the potential to revolutionize governance and financial inclusion within India, helping it overcome many of the structural and bureaucratic hurdles that held back its economic growth in the past. Its success has attracted considerable interest from countries around the world who are looking to replicate or plug into the India Stack, which may serve as another feather in the cap for India's growing stature and influence internationally. As Bill Gates put it, India is leapfrogging the world.
And now India is looking to export some of its software abroad. In February at the G20 summit, Modi pitched on exporting India's UPI software, as Tush mentioned, its digital payment system. I'm always amazed in India how easy it is to pay using my smartphone. I was down in Goa several weeks ago and I could buy a coconut on the beach by using several different methods all through my smartphone. I think it's something that people in London or New York would be quite envious of. Google even recommended that the US Federal Reserve use UPI as its blueprint for developing its own digital payment software. The view in many parts of the world is that India isn't this hegemonic power and that its software can be trusted and used for good. Now, some countries have already matched up their banks with UPI. This includes neighbours like Bhutan and Nepal, and countries with large Indian expatriate populations like the UAE, Oman or Singapore to make sending home remittances easier. It really is the scale of the system in India, which is very impressive. Now, there are countries around the world which are planning to plug into this India stack. We look at the Philippines and Morocco, looking at formulating their own open source national ID too. Jamaica used the Indian stack technology to formulate its COVID-19 database. There are talks ongoing with multiple African countries to broaden out UPI.
But while the India Stack has garnered considerable praise from both within India and abroad, not just for improving the lives of millions of Indians, but also improving Joe's coconut buying abilities, questions abound about the safety and viability of this technology. In particular, the Aadhaar database has had several data leaks and breaches, with the private data of hundreds of millions of Indians being released and sold over the internet. Are concerns about privacy and security being ignored in the rush to implement this platform? And could the system potentially be hijacked by bad actors to perhaps infringe on the fundamental rights of Indian citizens? Our next guest is someone who has been at the core of making the India Stack a global brand, and he could help us break down these pressing issues and what the India Stack means for India's economy and governance in the future. Stay tuned.
So we're delighted to welcome one of India's leading private sector financiers to the podcast this week. Gaurav Narain is the co-head of equities at Ocean Dial Asset Management and the manager of the India Capital Growth Fund. Gaurav joined Ocean Dial in November 2011, having been already immersed in the Indian equity markets for the previous 18 years. He has held senior positions as both a fund manager and an equities analyst at New Horizon Investments, ING Investment Management India, and SG Asia Securities India. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the podcast, Gaurav. How are you?
I'm great, Joe. Thanks for having me here.
So, Gaurav, the India Stack has generated considerable excitement in policy and business circles, at least. A lot of our foreign and even our Indian listeners may not be familiar with this specific term, despite the near ubiquitousness of some of the technologies involved in India. So, for instance, you have Aadhaar and UPI. So, could you describe for our audience maybe the vision or the philosophy behind the India Stack? What are the layers of the stack? And on a broader level, how does this relate to the idea of digital public infrastructure?
Actually, the genesis of this is that a large part of the country is still in rural India. I would say 60% of the population is still rural economic dependent. And they really, I would say there are two or three Indias where, you have the cities and urban centers which are in touch with any global city. But the rest of India was in a different world. And the idea of the digital stack was to really integrate the whole country. And it wasn't being done by the private sector simply because the cost of disseminating services to different parts of the country was just not viable because of low income levels. So really the government came up with the digital stack. And I think the core of this is, unlike what you see in the Western world, is this is public owned. It's virtually free of cost. And it's a very, very high volume transaction stack. So I would say there are three layers to it. The first layer is what we call the digital identity. It's called the Aadhaar, and it's something like a social security number, except it's a lot more technology advanced. What the government did was that they created a digital identity in the form of a 12-digit number for every Indian. What it does is it has a photograph, it has a fingerprint, and it has a retina scan. And why this was done was that in India, if you're, say, born in a village or a small town, many times you really weren't even born in a hospital or you had no birth certificate. So a large part of the country actually had no identity. So really the government went house to house, and, in the villages, they used the village elder to certify X person. This is the name, this is his date of birth, and this is his address, and that became the digital identity. And I would say today, almost every Indian, which is about 1.4 billion people, have a digital identity. And this is, I would say, the first layer. Once you got everyone having actually can claim who he or she is, you created a bank account for each household. So the government came up with the directive that every household should have a bank account, and banks were really forced to do it. So over a span of 2 years, 400 million bank accounts were opened, and the digital identity was used as the eKYC for it. So today I could say that it takes 30 seconds to open a bank account. So this was, I would say, the first layer where you had an identity and a bank account with each household. Then came the next layer, which is called the UPI, which is the United Payment Interface. This is like any payment gateway, except it's free of cost. So you can do a peer-to-peer transaction, you can do a peer-to-merchant transaction, a merchant-to-merchant transaction. It's very simple. All you need is a mobile phone number, and you can make a transaction. So this has again transformed India, because suddenly the unbankable came into the banking system, and you can make transactions as low as 2 cents simply because there's no cost to it. So every small shopkeeper, street vendor is a part of the system. So every place you'll find a QR code or just a phone number and you make these transactions. And people are now being able to transfer money straight to their households and villages, etc. So I think that was the second layer of the transaction. And to give an idea, today, 45% of global real-time transactions happen in India. That's about 9 billion transactions a month. That's the scale of operations we're talking about. So the next layer is what is called, I would say, the data layer. This is where what the government has done is they're trying to get every service provider to be able to share data. So today there's something called DigiLocker, where everything from your driving license to your insurance policies, everything is linked. As I said, about 300 such service providers, 2,000 such services where you have everything linked. So everything is really on your phone now. And I would say these are the three layers on which the India stack has been built. And as I mentioned, it's open architecture. So all private, public sector, every entity can build layers and layers upon it to use these services.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, the foundation of this India stack is the Aadhaar program, creating this biometric digital identity for more than 1 billion people. But the lesser known addendum, which I think people should understand more of its impact, is the eKYC, the Know Your Customer processes, which allowed users to verify and authenticate their data online. So maybe give people an idea of what were the challenges faced by the Indian public and Indian businesses before the implementation of these systems, and what impact has it had on their lives and their dealings, with each other, with the government and the private sector.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for anyone was that they had no identity. As I mentioned, in the cities, people like us all have passports and enough proof for any service you want. But that's not the case as you go down to tier 3, 4 towns. So I think that was the big transformation, that with everyone having that identity, you could actually roll out services at a very rapid pace. I mentioned the bank accounts, and the simple fact is you just give your 12-digit number and your eKYC is done. Likewise, today virtually everyone has a telephone, a SIM card, because of the same process. You just give your 12-digit number and the your KYC is done. So a lot of services across areas, you just need that 12-digit number and your eKYC is done. Banks tell us that earlier it used to cost almost $12 to do your whole KYC verification. Today that cost is down to as low as 6 cents, which is why you've seen rural India come to urban India simply because you were able to open such accounts. The cost of transmission has become very low. Now, you talked about how people are benefiting. One is clearly money transfers. For example, earlier, today every household in rural India has someone working in urban centers. But the fact is, if they had to send money to their village, you have to look out for someone who's going to your village, collect money, send it through him. There's sometimes pilferage, it doesn't reach them, or the person takes away some money. Then it moved to somewhere where an ATM machine was somewhere close to the village. So there'd be one person who had an account and was a designated person, and he'd take a slot transaction charge to transfer money. Today, it's all seamless. But I think the biggest change has happened is because everyone has bank accounts, the government is able to what they call the direct benefit transfer. All services, all subsidies, everything goes straight into bank accounts. And I'll give you an example. When COVID happened, in the US, the government was giving checks to every individual. In India, what the government did was they just identified who should be the beneficiaries, people who are below the poverty line, and the money was transferred straight into their account. Today, I would say over 300 different government subsidy schemes, the money is transferred straight into bank accounts. So huge savings in leakages. Corruption has come down dramatically, and the end beneficiary, the person who's the recipient, gets the entire amount directly into his bank. So there's this transmission of funds is leading to savings for government. It's benefiting individuals, and a lot of services have been rolled out on top of that. So, for example, you've got insurance schemes launched for the poor, and a whole host of services have just been riding piggyback on the fact that today, with this eKYC and the bank accounts, you've been able to identify the target audience for every service.
Well, for me, probably the most exciting or part of the India stack that I use most regularly, which is the Unified Payments Interface, commonly known as UPI here in India, which has radically simplified digital payments through smartphones. Now, I can't imagine life without UPI here. And I think, particularly doing my job as a journalist, I've been fortunate to travel right across India. I think back to January, February, where I spent several weeks in Bihar and in rural Bihar in the north of India. And it wasn't often easy to access an ATM as we were outside of Patna, outside of the urban areas. But it meant that I could still pay for transport, for food, for anything I needed really through UPI. It is remarkable, how widespread this is or how it's been used right across India. What has facilitated UPI's rapid adoption across the country? Why have we seen this in India as opposed to in other countries globally? And what sets UPI apart from other existing payments platforms?
I think the one big difference is between other payment systems is that it's free of cost. So everyone from a street side vendor, all he needs is a phone number, and all bank accounts are linked to that phone number. So it's really, I think it's free of cost. Two, it's very simple to use. And of course, COVID also helped it. And, as people get used to it, I think just the scale itself leads to it. But I think the key is that the government owns this infrastructure. So every vendor is on it simply because he does not have to pay that 2 to 3% charges for a POS machine and the merchant charges for other things. So I think that's the key. As I mentioned earlier in my first answer, that I think in India, cost of transmission is always the biggest issue. And once you overcome that, which is what the government has done by owning this infrastructure, the scale in India is always massive.
Right. And it's interesting because it's the scale and how to manage that scale is, for me, the most interesting part of this, because you have 1.4 billion people. You have them set across different religious communities, different geographies, literate, illiterate, different income levels. And somehow this one system is being created, which everyone from the poorest person in a rural district in Bihar or someone in Mumbai like us, the wealthy city in India, can access almost at an equal level. And it's also unlocked a lot of other opportunities. So for, I guess, a foreign investor, what this is you've created a digital identity for almost all Indians. You've created a system where you can verify that identity and associated documents that the individual might possess. And then you've added a component where you make financial transactions easier. So, for instance, I saw this report which said that if India had to adopt the normal point-of-sale credit debit card approach, it would have reached this level of financial penetration by 2040. And it's taken 6 years to do what it would have taken half a century to finish. So it's that leveraging and that scale that's interesting. But I wanted to ask you about the commercial opportunities in particular, because we understand perhaps the benefits of giving a billion Indians an identity, what that might mean for welfare transfers, what that might mean for targeted subsidies, let's say. But what does that mean for, say, companies operating in India? To my mind, it solves a lot of the problems that have been traditionally associated with the Indian economy, for instance, contract enforcement. So maybe talk about the prospects for development in the commercial sector and the private sector, and what this might mean for investors who used to be wary of investing in India earlier and now maybe looking at this new opportunity.
Yeah, so I think, one, I'd like to also highlight this whole system is interoperable. So, everyone from a fintech company to a bank is part of this whole ecosystem on the payment side. And say the biggest player in terms of transactional volume would be someone like a Google Pay. Now, what the opportunity it's throwing you is that now everyone is in the there is a digital track record happening, and multiple companies are being able to leverage on this to scale up businesses, be it insurance companies. Take one of the biggest growing segments today is retail finance. Now, why this is happening is simply that now people are able to have data. Fintechs are now just specializing in being able to, as I mentioned, to use this data which they're getting from even small shop owners to be able to provide services like funding them. A lot of these people earlier had to go to money lenders because they didn't have the documentation or to really get these loans. Today, when you're into this whole digital system, they have access to your bank records, your daily payments in and out. And with all the database, you have everything linked to your indirect tax payments. So everything is now linked. And that's what's driving, say, on the financial side, that the unbanked have come into the banking system. They're getting loans, and a lot of companies are trying to leverage on these. Fintechs in particular, a whole business model has been created about to lending in areas where banks typically did not go. So it's really, even in consumer companies, earlier, India has 12 million mom and pop shops. Even the largest consumer company like Unilever's covered directly only half of these shops. So they are leveraging on this technology in the way they're being able to now manage the inventories. So it's really transforming India in every aspect. That rural India is actually becoming part of the complete India. So which is really aiding to the growth. And multiple business models are coming in, which is why India is actually attracting a lot of foreign direct investments. It's averaging about $75 to $80 billion a year. And largely because people are seeing this opportunity open up. Earlier, India was also one where, people said it's a big country, but finally, you find that only 20% of the country is where you can actually do business. That's changing.
Right. And I think that has immense implications because if you think about it, the vast majority of Indians are not in the formal sector. If you're, let's say, in a mom and pop shop in the corner, or if you have a food vendor, it's very difficult for them to get credit. And credit it's what drives the economy, a growing economy further. But now you can have a digital record of all their transactions. You can have a DigiLocker of all their, information and data, and you have a way to enforce that. So it really opens up the financial sector to basically microloans, which is quite incredible. But I think I want to ask this question in the context of the next steps for India Stack. And in particular, I've heard this concept called account aggregator, which seems to be a way of managing people's data with the consent of the people providing the data. So very different to, let's say, Silicon Valley in the US. Maybe could you explain the idea behind account aggregators and what impacts would this have on the Indian economy in the future?
Yeah, it's basically, account aggregator is a simple system for sharing data. So it's like a one-stop platform containing all the documentations if you want to apply for, say, a loan. So example, today, if say I want to apply for a housing loan, I go to this home loan company or a bank, and they'll ask for multiple datas, right from your bank statements to, there'll be 10, 15 different types of documentations, your income tax statements, your employment certificate, your shares, your salary slip, etc., etc. And you were man trying to provide this data. Now what's happened is that the central bank has appointed about 8 entities, which are called account aggregators. So what they're doing is they're just linking themselves to all these databases. And all I have to do is tell the account aggregator, give him permission to access the data. And he gets all this data straight from the source. So they're right from my bank account statements to my house rent, to my tax statement, to my KYC, to everything comes straight onto the account aggregator, and he shares it with the home loan provider. So for me, I don't have to go through the headache. For the home loan company, he knows it's absolute authentic data because it's coming straight from the source. And he's able to take that decision in seconds. He just has systems and processes and use various algorithms, and he takes that decision to provide the loan in seconds. Now, take the case, for me, I have all this data on hand. I could have still given it. It would have taken me a week to collect it. But take the case of, say, a small shopkeeper. He has no such data record because he's not paying taxes. He's not maintaining books of records. But in his case also, all he has to do is go to the account aggregator and give the permission. What the account aggregator does is it takes his bank account, it takes his whatever indirect taxes he's paying for the purchases he's made, what is his electricity bill, monthly electricity bill which he's paying, if he's paying a rent, what is the sort of rent he's getting. And all that data goes to the loan provider, and that person through his own system, etc., figures out, okay, this is actually the sort of turnover this shop should be having. This is a daily business, and then take a call and providing the loan. So really, even the unbanked who used to go to the money lender is now in a position where he can actually go to for a bank or someone for a loan, simply because all the data which he himself doesn't have is being aggregated at one end and collated and given to the service provider. So it's really eliminating fraud where people are giving fraud bank statements, etc. But I think it's just ensuring, with other forms of technology, you're suddenly seeing many parts of India coming into this economy. So I think that's what the account aggregator is really doing, that it's collating every data at one point and just making it easy and simple and very efficient, the whole system in being able to disperse credit and other services.
It's certainly true that the Indian economy is absolutely booming at the moment, as you say. The world's fastest growing large economy. In addition to my journalism, I do political and financial consulting for a range of multinationals sort of around the world. And it's no exaggeration to say that everyone, is either wants to come to India or is expanding their presence in India. I think the India stack in itself then also offers opportunities globally. It's getting a lot of interest from abroad. We discussed earlier in the podcast, collaborations with countries like the Philippines, with Jamaica. How do you think that India intends to internationalize the India stack going forward? And which countries do you think it would be interest of?
Well, I think India is, because it's an open architecture, India is willing to, has been, a lot of countries have really looked at trying to adopt some form of the India stack. I think two countries, Philippines and Morocco, have already started building out something very similar. But I think even countries like the US, etc., have had a detailed look at our whole Aadhaar system, the digital identity, because it's possibly the most sophisticated anywhere in the world. I think when COVID happened, India created just an app called CoWIN, which rode on the Aadhaar system, and India was able to administer almost 9 billion vaccines in a month, because you could fix appointments through this app. You administered the vaccine and instantly your certificate was uploaded. 4 or 5 countries took that same app and adopted it in their countries. I was reading yesterday also that the Shanghai Cooperation, a movement of 8-9 countries who are also exploring on how to take this India stack and implement it in their countries. So I think the whole world is really looking at how to have such a system across many other countries. And I think the World Bank is very involved in this whole discussion, where it's really trying from their perspective that, they find the system which is exceptionally good and one of the best in the world, and trying to take it forward to other countries as well.
So, like any new system, or relatively new system, we should say, there are certain parts that need tweaking. We have seen, kind of while digital public infrastructure has grown, concerns about privacy and security of data. There have periodically been breaches and leaks in the Aadhaar database in India. So how do you think that these could be avoided or mitigated in the future? Because I think this is something that's going to be key when we talk about exporting the stack internationally. Do you foresee any new legislation, for example, being taken to guarantee data privacy and security?
Yeah, I think this is a hot debate in every country, and in India as well. I think what India currently lacks today is a comprehensive data protection bill. And I think a lot of work is happening into it, and you may see something come out. But obviously, there are a lot of debates happening on how it should be, and it shouldn't be an overkill in terms of what they're doing. So even a lot of the global digitech companies have shared their views with the government. So I think this is something which will always be a problem factor. I think in India's specific case, also because it is publicly owned and the government has access to a lot of data, I think one of the bigger debates is also that this data can be misused by the government a lot. and you're possibly seeing some of it also happen. Because other than the digital stack, India has also implemented its goods and services tax, which is an entire digital indirect taxation system across the country. A lot of other areas have also got digitized. So I think the government has access to a lot of data of other politicians, other businessmen, and I think the whole political system is very worried that this government could misuse that data for its own vested interests. So I think you have two big issues really on leakages of data itself and misuse of data.
And just to ask along the question, how do you foresee sort of regulation coming into this sector? Taking perhaps an example from the financial sector, is this something that there would be like a body created in order to draw up regulations? Or do you think there needs to be some sort of a legislative act that's passed in, let's say, the parliament?
I think eventually there's most likely going to be an act passed in parliament. So a lot of debate is already going on this side of it. And as I mentioned, India does need a comprehensive data protection bill. I think something will have to happen on it, because already, like in the Western world here itself, even a lot of, there is a lot of intervention by the government on a lot of social media companies, a lot of global companies. So it's already a very hot topic. And I think we have the IT minister, very sharp guy, is very well educated. He knows what he's doing. So I'm sure there will be a lot of progress being made on this, because it's a very key issue given the way the world is digitizing.
So Joe, that was a fascinating discussion. And I think for me, the implications of the India stack are much wider than simply an identity system or perhaps a way to exchange money. So consider some of these use cases when you think of India. For instance, a lot of people complain about contract enforcement, especially foreign companies investing in India. A lot of aid agencies talk about the difficulties of delivering aid over India's geographic and population diversity. But now you can, for instance, if you, let's say, sell cars, if you want to target people from a lower income strata who may not necessarily have the money to pay upfront, you can start a targeted payments plan where their payments per month are linked to their Aadhaar, or their UPI rather, where you're guaranteed to make a return on your investment. And even if you're selling to consumers who are not traditionally in the income bracket that buy a product, you could also talk about foreign companies who want to invest into Indian companies who now have all the details, bank records, income tax payments, how much they export, where they own land, the revenues, etc. And this extends not just to the largest corporations who would have these figures optimized for European American investors, but also for medium and small businesses. And this is where you can target many more opportunities. Back in 2004, there's an economist called C.K. Prahlad who talked about the idea of the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. And he talked about the idea of how the unbanked, unserved masses also have desires and also have the income to which they could fulfill those desires if only the private sector and businesses made room or made it possible to sell products to them. And I think the India stack genuinely allows that. By connecting all of India under a single interoperable database that other applications and other businesses can plug into, you've really unleashed the potential of the Indian economy and overcome a lot of the problems that traditionally businesses and individuals have found operating in India. But as a certified foreigner who has operated in India, what do you think?
Certified foreigner indeed. Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable, isn't it? And as you say, I think, so I spend a lot of my day-to-day life dealing with corporates that want to come to India, and often the challenge they mentioned in the past is ease of doing business here, or ease of making payments, as you mentioned, or having access to consumers and customers. And I think what the India stack has done is completely changed the game. And it's also an incredibly valuable soft power tool, I would say, for India. I mean, it's no secret that India is known for its prowess when it comes to technology. I mean, you look at the CEOs of the world's major tech companies, from Google Cloud to Microsoft to Vimeo to YouTube. These are all individuals of Indian origin. But India stack is something that, is perhaps less well known about abroad, but I think something, as I mentioned previously, that we're going to hear increasingly more about in the years to come. I think talks are ongoing at the moment with 9 African countries to outsource or to export the technology and the software. And again, you could see it being replicated and having these similar transformative effects. in other countries, we're looking at something like Nigeria or Ethiopia, countries with large populations that are seeking to stimulate economic growth to match this population growth. I think it's been valuable for India to be the country that is sharing this technology. We say this almost every week, I think, on the podcast, but it is a phenomenally exciting time to be in the country. And yeah, it keeps us on our toes, trying to keep up with the various exciting developments kind of across different sectors.
Yeah, and I think we've talked a lot about, say, private businesses. We've talked a lot about the commercial opportunities, maybe the administrative efficiencies. But I think the one comment that really swung it for me in terms of the way I look at it was your former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. He was in a conference in London that had nothing to do with India at all. It was about governance in Britain. And he argued for government programs that actually serve the needs of the poor. He pointed to ways the government could pull out people from poverty in the most effective manner. And he pointed to the India stack as one of those ways that the government could do it. So to me, this gives me a tremendous amount of hope. In the 21st century, we're not only faced with the challenges of war, of global plagues, etc., the ones we normally face, but also the idea of financial inclusion. What do we do about the people watching people getting rich who wonder why they can't access that wealth or that lifestyle? And I think having this sort of an open access program that's free from 99% of the population is the way to go for that. So yeah, extremely excited. And hopefully we'll have more similar subjects to cover about the Indian economy in the future.
So that's all we've got time for this week on Beyond the Indus. But a huge thank you to all of our listeners and to Gaurav for joining us. And we hope you'll all tune in next time.